I'm really happy to introduce this next panel on cooperation and conflict. I'll introduce our chair of the panel. I was actually just informed that Jessica Stern, who's the research professor at the Pardee School of Global Studies, and she is an expert on the perpetrators of violence and the possible connections between trauma and terror. She's served on President Clinton's National Security Council staff and as an analyst at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. But the fun fact that I was just informed of is that in a movie, her role was played by Nicole Kidman. So we had George Clooney this morning. We have Nicole Kidman on our panel. Take it away, Jessica.
George Clooney as the
So I also want to start by thanking Richard de Neufville. It was a life-changing experience for me, and I know for many of us in this room, to get to attend this program. And I also want to say how excited I am to see Noelle, Jessica, Munzer, to see how the program keeps evolving. It's such a joy. And I will also say that I got to spend some time with students last night, and that was also just a thrill to be around students who really want to change the world and make it better through their understanding of both technology and policy. So thank you, Richard, and thank you, Noelle and Munzer and Jessica, for bringing us all together. We have a great small panel. Matt, I guess we'll have Matt speak first, alphabetically. I was fortunate to get to work with Matt. He was in the Office of Science and Technology Policy when I was in the National Security Council. He did his undergraduate degree at MIT, and I've just learned that he kept switching around physics. Then he wanted to be a writer. Ultimately, he biology, ultimately political science, and then he did his doctorate here after working in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Taylor is an economist, and he went to Sloan, and he worked in the OECD for many years on digital economy. So I haven't had a chance to work with him, but I'm really excited about beginning. So Matt's going to tell us about nuclear issues. I always love getting an update on what's happening in the world of nuclear smuggling. Matt is the world's foremost expert on this topic.
Unfortunately, I'm not actually going to talk very much about nuclear smuggling.
But another time.
That's life. I'm happy to in the Q&A. I do have to tell us a story about Jessica in the days we were working together. When she was helping with the script for the movie in which she was ultimately played by Nicole Kidman, or a character very loosely based on her was played by Nicole Kidman, she was trying to convince me to help out with this script. And she was like, you know, they really don't get what nuclear weapons are actually like. You should, you know, consult with them and explain it to them, and that, you know, they're filming in Prague. You could go over there. I was like, excuse me, Jessica, let me get this straight. You want a person with an active nuclear weapon design clearance to fly to a sensitive country to explain to Hollywood filmmakers exactly what the inside of a nuclear weapon actually looks like so they can put it up on the big screen. Somehow this doesn't seem like a really good idea to me. I can assure you that in the movie it doesn't, the real ones don't look anything like what's in the movie. Anyway, be that as it may. So I work on nuclear weapons policy, nuclear energy policy, and I would say, like the other challenges we've been hearing about interdisciplinary work all day long, and there's a reason for it. The reason is most of the big challenges facing society can't possibly be solved with the perspectives from any one discipline. I would say also, relating to the last panel, they can't be solved with the perspectives from any one country either. So my group at Harvard, I try to make sure, is both interdisciplinary and international for that reason. And I say to students that to make policy related to nuclear weapons, you really need at least 3 sort of core areas of knowledge. One is some technical background in nuclear technologies. So you can understand whether a country having this in place is more or less of a risk than a country having that in place. Secondly, an understanding of the policy tools that are available and what works well under what circumstances, whether it's treaties, sanctions, inspections, military strikes, what have you. What do we understand about these policy tools and how well they work and how applicable they are? What are the treaties? What do they say? And so on. And then finally, how states and organizations behave so that you have some idea if we make this proposal or this threat, what are the plausible scales of reaction that we're going to get to it. And then you have to integrate those understandings so that they all work together. And in particular, on the sort of state behavior and organizational behavior, you really have to understand what are the incentives of the people in the system. And when we talked about how do you influence policy, for example, the first thing is to think about who has to make the decision in order to implement the policy that I'm advocating, and what does the world look like from their perspective? How did they define the problem that they're trying to solve? Can I make my idea fit into their concept of what they're trying to do? Because then it's much more likely you'll be able to convince them to do it. So on this integration, let me talk a little bit about the recent deal with Iran, because this is an amazing example of a fantastically complex integration of a lot of areas of knowledge and a lot of different policy tools, ranging from a really complex sanctions regime, which is sufficiently complex that we're actually having difficulty unraveling it enough for Iran to actually get the benefits it was promised in the agreement. Technical issues, I don't know how many of you have had a chance to look through the JCPOA, but the nuclear annex, unless you really understand enrichment, there's going to be passages of the nuclear annex where you'll just be like, I have no idea what this is saying here. And the domestic politics in Iran and in the United States, and then alliance politics and sort of coalition politics with people who weren't allies, like China and Russia, but were nonetheless working together on this. It was, for those of you who have worked on game theory and political science, what is referred to as a multi-level game with a lot of different levels in it. The nuclear specifics were negotiated by two men from MIT. Minister Salehi, or Vice President Salehi, I should say, is the head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, is a PhD nuclear engineer from MIT. And Ernie Moniz, the Secretary of Energy, obviously was chairman of the physics department, head of the energy initiative here at MIT. They both have a deep understanding of technology, but they're a cabinet secretary and a vice president. They both also have deep understanding of their domestic circumstances, the constraints that they faced politically, and how to navigate those constraints. And a lot of the nuclear provisions were negotiated literally one-on-one between the two of them. And the MIT connection definitely helped in sort of building the relationship that allowed them to work together. I would say the key questions that we're looking at in the future in nuclear policy almost all combine technology issues with issues related to state and organizational behavior. How do we structure future nuclear forces and other policies to reduce to the lowest level possible the risk that nuclear weapons would actually be used in ways that would actually kill people? How do we, one of the things I've worked on a lot, as Jessica mentioned, is nuclear security, nuclear smuggling. I was the guy who talked then Senator Obama into the idea of a 4-year effort to try to secure all the nuclear material in the world and so on. But a lot of that has to do with organizations and convincing them that this is a real threat and that just checking the box of what the regulator said you had to do isn't good enough, and that you actually have to focus on excellence in performance in nuclear security the way you focus on excellence in your overall operations of your organization. So again, it gets down to a combination of the technologies of nuclear security and organizational behavior. How do we stop illicit transfers of the technologies related to nuclear material? So Iran, for example, was the world's premier shopper in black markets for nuclear technologies. All over the world, very successfully. There's a company here in Massachusetts, MKS, that makes the world's best pressure transducers. They have about 70% of the pressure transducer market. And they make them for all sorts of completely legitimate civilian purposes. And they're also very useful for uranium enrichment, for managing your centrifuges. If you look at the Natanz enrichment plant, there are hundreds of MKS centrifuges installed in that plant. And what happened was they had a subsidiary in Shanghai, and a Iranian procurement agent managed to corrupt one of the people at that subsidiary. The corrupted agent at the subsidiary basically faked up an order from an existing real MKS client, sent it off to MKS headquarters in Massachusetts. They looked at it. It's a known client, perfectly reasonable, purpose. Looks like a perfectly reasonable order, filed for the export application. The US government looked at it. Known client, known civilian purpose, no problem, approved. Off it went, and then diverted straight to Iran. I don't think it actually ever arrived in China. Some people have been arrested and are now in jail on that one. How do we convince states not to build nuclear weapons? And what role does the availability of the science and technology for nuclear weapons have in that? We have actually a very interesting puzzle right now where technology has globalized, right? And we're talking about 1945 technology. It's not actually cutting edge anymore. And yet, the nuclear weapons programs that have occurred recently have been, on average, less successful and taken longer than the nuclear weapons programs that occurred in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Why is that? We don't have a really good answer to that question. I think it's only partly that our efforts to stop the spread of technology have been somewhat successful. One theory developed by my colleague Jacques Heymans is that essentially, as nuclear weapons programs went to the developing world, it was much more frequently the case that they were being done in dictatorships that didn't understand that letting the scientists and the engineers manage themselves was the way to get things done, and constantly interfered in the technical management of the programs in ways that caused them to fail. And there's lots of good cases, especially in Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Hussein Kamal's insane management of their nuclear weapons program, for example. So what are the methods we're going to need to think about all this? We need to integrate qualitative analysis with technical understanding. There is a fair amount of quantitative statistical work being done in non-proliferation at the moment. I would say the vast majority of it is nonsense. The reality is there are 10 states that have nuclear weapons, right? Generating large N out of this, a lot of my colleagues are doing it, and it's magic. So I have a colleague who did a book about transfers of enrichment or reprocessing technology, and he has tens of thousands of observations. I'm like, what the heck are these tens of thousands of observations? So it's like every pair of states for a year in the international system since 1945. So it's like, Tuvalu didn't transfer to Ghana again this year. Woohoo! And he's got about a dozen real cases of the phenomenon he's looking at. And more than half of those are either A.Q. Khan from Pakistan, who led a global black market network, or France. This is not a large N problem. This is a very, very small N problem. Anyway, sorry to go on about that. We need a understanding of organizational behavior and incentives. Again, that's absolutely essential. Again and again and again it comes up. An understanding, one of the things I took away from TPP was thinking about complex systems in a systems dynamics framework. And I think that way of thinking is very much underutilized in national security issues generally. But you need to be very careful to understand the limits of these kinds of models and the assumptions that you're putting into them that drive them. I've seen a lot of models that really did have the sign wrong over the years. So I think I will actually stop there and just say thank you to TPP. Thank you to Richard de Neufville, as Jessica was saying. It really was a great program. I personally am distressed at the end of the ESD PhD program and the creation of the new PhD program. I think there's, I would like to see less emphasis on the notion that large data analysis is the only way to do good work. I think I personally would not have been admitted in the new program, but anyway.
Good.
So thank you very much. I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to come speak to you today. I think the best way to start off any public speech that I give is to talk about my sister's drug problem. I think that's always makes sense. So my sister has a drug problem. And it's a drug problem not where she uses drugs, but because there's a lot of drugs actually being produced in the town where she lives. So we were having a phone discussion the other day, let's say, about this drug problem in her town and trying to come up with some policy things that we could do to help fix this. The issue is that there's a lot of crystal meth labs that are being run inside people's houses. And as you know, crystal methamphetamine is very volatile. It can explode in the basement. It pollutes. It's a big problem. And the police in that area actually don't have a way to kind of figure out what's going on very well. It's difficult for them to get inside the homes, see inside the homes for what's going on. So we had a discussion the other day and talking about this drug problem. And she said, you know, you work in policy. Can you come up, like, what are some of the things that we could do to tackle this? And I said, well, you know, when I was a kid, I was always fascinated by skeleton keys. And I don't know if we actually call them those anymore, but these skeleton keys are keys that actually will open any lock. And I thought, you know, what we could propose to the town council is they come up with an ordinance that actually says that every single lock in the town is openable with this skeleton key. And what that would do is it would actually make your town much safer because the police would have a copy of this key that they would keep in the police headquarters. So it will be secure. Don't worry, it's going to be secure. The police have a copy. And whenever there was an emergency, you know, some sort of medical problem, they could actually run over to the police department, grab this key, and unlock your door. And I thought, this is going to be fantastic because this will solve all of our problems, giving this key to the police department. Well, my sister, despite the drug problem, was thinking straight. And she said, actually, Taylor, this is a really bad idea. And so she came up with really 4 issues why it was a bad idea for us to give this key to the police department and let them be in charge of coming into my house. So the first one, she said, there's an issue with storing this skeleton key at the police department. She said, first of all, who has access to it? Which of the officers, and where is this thing kept? And I said, well, you know, you put it in a locked box somewhere and it will be okay. And she said, well, there's a lot of traffic in and out of the police department. They may be busy with something. Couldn't it get stolen? And I thought, oh, okay, maybe there is an issue with who has access to it at the police department. She also said that the idea of having one single key that can unlock all of the homes in the town becomes a problem. Because if someone outside were able to clone this key, the skeleton key that's held in the office, it'd be very easy for them to come to any door, open it up, and steal all of our stuff. She also said, you know, look, we may be successful here in our little drug town of breaking the cycle by having the skeleton key, but there's a problem that if other towns nearby, other states, and even other countries decide that this is the way to go, there may be one skeleton key that opens up the doors in all the houses in our country as well as others. So we've gone from having control at the police station to it can be any of the skeleton keys anywhere around the world that can open up each of these houses. And finally, she said, there's a problem with the complexity that this adds. If you tell lock manufacturers that they must design their locks in a way that this skeleton key can open it up, we've added complexity into the system, and this makes it much easier to crack. So I agreed with my sister. I said, yes, this is a drug problem, but I think a skeleton key is not the way to deal with this. So with this story, it may sound completely far-fetched, and that's the reason I like it, because you think, I'm not going to give the police, a key to my home. But this debate is going on right now as we speak. And it's not about the keys to get into your physical home. It is about encryption keys to get into your digital life. And there are countries right now that are putting forward proposals that would weaken encryption, essentially weaken the keys that keep our stuff locked up, or would actually put back doors like these skeleton keys and make them available to law enforcement and people around the world. So we think this is a really bad situation, and it's one of the key areas of research in our group, the Internet Policy Research Initiative here at MIT. I said far-fetched, it seems far-fetched, but David Cameron came out last year and actually was pushing to make it so that any digital communications that passed through ISPs in the UK would have to be deliverable to police in clear text, which would essentially mean you could not have end-to-end encryption on these things because someone in the middle would have to be able to decrypt it and pass it over to police. Now, this made us very worried, and it made a lot of people worried around the world. We actually invited Robert Hannigan, who is the head of GCHQ, which is the UK's equivalent of the NSA, to come speak here at MIT in March. He is very technically capable, and he's very good with policy. And what he eventually said was, he gave his talk and he said, the world needs strong encryption. Do not weaken encryption. He also said, do not put backdoors because backdoors are readily accessible for criminals. What we need is strong encryption. We use it at the NSA. We use it at the GCHQ. We need strong encryption. What he did say, though, is that we need to be thinking of ways that companies can help law enforcement with legitimate, court-approved investigations. So it's not about weakening encryption. It's about using what sorts of metadata can we use to help with these investigations. So the reason I bring this up is because this calls for people like Robert Hannigan who have TPP skills, who have a policy background and also a technology background. And we see that in our sector, this is extremely important. We are thrilled with the idea that TPP for 40 years has been putting out students, spreading them out into the world who can think about things in both a technical and a policy sound way. And so I just want to support that. I want to talk about a second project that's going on because I talk about encryption, and all of you are likely familiar with the Apple FBI iPhone case. But I want to talk about a new technology that's being developed by someone in our group that I think also needs TPP skills in order for it to get off the ground. So I don't know if there are Europeans here in the room, but Europe has been pushing for what they call the right to be forgotten. And essentially this is, I don't like what the internet's saying about me or what's up there on the internet. I want to actually send out a broadcast saying, take me off the internet, pull me off the internet, get rid of the stuff that's there. I want to disconnect. And right now, legislation has gone into place that says people have to be able to do this, but tech companies really don't know how this is going to happen because of jurisdictional issues, because of the way that data is stored in different locations. It just doesn't work. There's also a big push in many countries after the Snowden revelations for what we call data localization that says we're worried about our data traffic traversing through the United States because of that it's going to be seen. So we think that all data needs to be stored domestically, either within our country or within the EU. But again, we don't have an ecosystem that's really built to support this. However, we've got kind of a secret weapon that's brewing over here in CSAIL under the leadership of Tim Berners-Lee. And many of you in TPP may know who Tim Berners-Lee is. He's probably one of the most famous people that people don't know who he is. And he is, and actually there's a very funny thing I saw. To give you a hint, at the opening of the London Olympics, there was this big shield, this big tarp that pulled up, and they showed this guy working on a computer on a desk. And the commentators in English were saying, who in the world is this Tim Berners-Lee guy that's here? Well, he's the guy who invented the World Wide Web. And he is a professor over here at MIT. And so he's someone who thinks in really big ideas about changing the way that we access information. So he has a project that is called Solid. And what Solid does is it disconnects the applications that you use from the data that you store. And so right now, if you use Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat, any of these, and I assume most of you are not using Snapchat, your children probably are, but if you're using these technologies, what happens is the app that you use pulls in the information and it stores it locally. Not locally is the wrong one. It stores it on, for example, Facebook servers. So the pictures of your vacation in Maldives are going to be stored on Facebook servers. And Facebook may give you some control about how you can turn off or on and off privacy settings for those. But essentially, Facebook has those pictures and Facebook controls them. What Tim and his group with Solid are trying to do is make a break between that. So Facebook would provide an app that would let people see your photos. But in order for Facebook to access their photos, they would have to come over to your own server and pull them off. So you would have, for example, a server running at your own home that would have all your pictures, have everything that you needed, and you would decide which applications had access to what. And from one day to the next, you could turn it on or off. So Tim has this great project that you can see has really interesting examples and uses, particularly in terms of the right to be forgotten. Because if Europe does push forward with this right to be forgotten, essentially you could have all of your data on your own server, and the day that you want to be forgotten, you turn it off. Or you just set your parameters that you turn off access. It also works for data localization because you get to choose where all of your photos, where all of your data is stored, and it can be on private servers, it can be at home, it can be in the cloud, but you have ultimate control over that. Now, I bring that up because Tim and his team are wonderful engineers, they're big thinkers, and they can come up with great stuff. They have a platform that's working very well, and they're trying to build apps that this works on. But there's a missing component in what I would say is Tim's team. And we need people who can actually look at the engineering and also fit that, connect it back to the policy, and connect it as well to business plans and business models. So we need people who have the skills to look at, this is fantastic technology. I understand how the APIs work. I understand the technology. But then figure out how do we tie this into the policy discussions about right to be forgotten, and how do we come up with business plans that make this workable? So in summary, those two examples are just to say that in our group, we see TPP has a very strong future, and we are looking to raise money so that we can bring in more TPP students to work with us and address some of these big issues. So thank you very much.
Wow. I think both of these speakers have really shown how important this kind of education is. It's fascinating that you're looking for TPP grads, and I know that Matt would never be able to do the work he does without the education in many different topics that he has. Why don't we take questions? I'll ask a question. So, Taylor, this idea that Tim has, how expensive would that be if each,
So I'm not on the team that's working on Solid. So I'm familiar with it. There's quite an interesting thing going on here because if you step back, if I look back at my educational career, when I started as a university student a long time ago, we actually worked on mainframes. So we had a small terminal that was out in the hall.
You're dating yourself.
Yeah, I know.
I did too.
we had terminals that were sitting out in the hall on these small little desks. It was just a monitor and a keyboard. And we would log into the mainframe and do our work from there. Then all of a sudden, these PCs came around, and they were super powerful. And so we moved the computing power back onto the PCs. And we thought, this was fantastic. I've got a computer on my desk that can do anything. And it's funny because now we've kind of moved back the other direction again. We're pushing back into the cloud. So I do see these kind of cycles in terms of, where is the data stored? Is it stored locally? Is it stored in the cloud? And right now we're in this process where it's in the cloud. I think in terms of Tim's project, in terms of Solid, you can actually store the data anywhere. So this could be stored with data providers like AWS. It could be stored on your own home server. It could be stored here at MIT. And what they're doing is they're coming up with the platform, the protocols, in order to access the data and help point things to it. I think there is some added cost to making that work in terms of getting it all ties into locators so that Facebook knows where that picture of you on vacation in Maldives is located. But I think there's some overhead here, but in terms of the cost that Google is facing, that Facebook is facing in terms of adhering to this right to be forgotten, these are enormous.
Let me push back a little bit, because what I want forgotten is not what's on my Facebook page. It's what everybody else has copied from my Facebook page or my Snapchat or whatever. And so it's the stuff that the Chinese have sitting, on some server over there that is what's really problematic. How does this solve that problem?
So there's a group that Tim works with, that's within our group called
By the way,
Dig.
I'm one of the many people whose personal information was stolen by the Chinese
with OPM.
as part of OPM. I also had it stolen from DOE, and we recently had a Russian state-level attack at the Kennedy School that deeply penetrated into my account. So my personal information is available to every government who wants it.
So there is a line of work that's going on actually within our group called Accountable Systems. And what this does is it's looking at new ways of, for example, tracing the rights associated with content. So if I post a picture, how can I make it so that there is information, metadata there that tells how that picture can be used, when it can be used, and when it needs to be deleted. So there's a whole line of work that's going on within our group on these accountable systems to try and actually answer these questions. So you pair that with having control of the original data on your servers, and you can see how this could start to fit together.
I see a question over here.
Hi, Frank Gillette, class of 91. And after TPP, and I also ended up at Sloan to pick up sort of more business chops. I've ended up in market research in the computer industry, advising large enterprises, both on the engineering IT side as well as the marketing side, how their business and their customer behavior changes as they embrace all these technologies and so forth. So 2 comments. One, I like the ideas of Tim Berners-Lee, and there's some associated work that I've seen. It's something I've been thinking about in the research for our clients. Architecturally, it becomes really problematic from a performance point of view, and there's also a fundamental challenge about how deeply you have to change the code and the architecture of the internet. So the upshot from where I sit, thinking both about the technology and the policy of what you all just described, is it's a little on the scale of climate change in terms of getting the businesses to change their behavior to enable what was described. And so what I hear is Tim and his team probably are completely underestimating how you get from here to there, because they're developing an ideal of how it ought to be, but they're not enabling a path that anyone's going to embrace. Now I want to flip it to a larger thought that I've had as I've been listening to the conversation today. I ended up as the third or whatever it is who work in business rather than in sort of policy, government, NGO, or in academia. And I'm struck that we've really sort of stuck on the word policy, because I feel like when I was at TPP, we often talked about strategy. It was like, to make it palatable for business, you call it strategy instead of policy, right? Because policy is scary and uncomfortable, right? And I've watched in the 25 years since I graduated how some businesses, particularly in Silicon Valley, have really embraced notions of mission and a larger consciousness and awareness, still in self-interest for their own sort of public marketing perspective of how they're viewed. And Apple's stance on encryption is simply one example of that. But for the purposes of TPP and the dialogue that we're having in this panel, I wanted to propose, how do we have language and concepts that embrace more businesses and business strategists into the dialogue? And how do we talk more about the practical incentives, even including in the political discourse, about getting businesses involved? Because I'm not feeling that enough in the room. And sitting where I have been now for 20 years in market research around the technology and computer industry, I think there's some opportunity that maybe we're not taking advantage of.
If I can just quickly respond, I agree. I think I can't speak for Tim's views on this. I think Tim has he's taken on very big problems before, and I would have never predicted that they'd have been so successful. So I think he's a visionary, and what we want to do is pull together the right team that can actually put these things into practice. I agree, Facebook is not going to like this technology at all, because their business model is, we want access to the information, you give it to us and we give you something back.
It's going to cost them more operationally. Well, there's the implementation cost, but then operationally, it's just going to cost more money and energy to run the servers that way.
So I had a discussion with some members of his team last week, and I'm sorry, I had talking about all this up in front of everyone here, but I had some talks with members of his team last week saying, what are the use cases? What are some early kind of wins in terms of strategy that could happen here? And we looked for pain points, which is what they'll teach you over here at Sloan, is you got to find the pain points in the economy, you figure out where those are, you address them, and that's how you get things implemented. And I think we have not solved the problem with photo sharing. For some reason, I've got terabytes of photos sitting on spread out across computers at my house, and I'm pretty savvy at this stuff, and I still am having trouble managing my own photos. So I would say
it's not you. Apple's software still sucks.
Yeah. So I mean, everyone's.
Yes.
You've got Picasa. You've got what's Flickr. You've got different tools out there, but they don't work very well because you're talking about massive amounts of data. I think this is an area where a tool like Solid could come right in and say, look, we're going to give you some options to manage your own photos the way you want, that you put them in one place, they're backed up, it can be on AWS, it can be somewhere else, but that we have a tool here that gives you ultimate control of how your photos are used. So I think there is some low-hanging fruit there that I think needs to be thought about in a strategic way. But that's why I think we need technologists, but we also need people with this kind of the policy and the business and the economics background to look at these things.
So again, I think that's crucial not only in this area, but across almost all technological areas. You need to understand what are the incentives of the actors in the system in order to be able to understand, how can I change that system in a positive way. So it's a matter of incentives, it's a matter of organizational behavior, and so it seems to me that has to be a fundamental part of a TPP kind of education.
See a question over here?
I was just going to add that I think another skill set that's important in this is legal skills.
Yeah.
And particularly in the context of the IT technologies we're talking about, you could very easily imagine just the existence of a product like Solid will start to create pressure on the Facebooks and Googles of the world to change the underlying rights that exist between the private law between the user and the companies, right? So you can imagine a technology strategy that starts with the existence of technology, but plays out and gets propagated by pressure to change the click-through contracts that we all touch on. And that's especially true if you look outside the US to Europe and places that have stronger privacy law that you could imagine using, an antitrust law that you could imagine using in a litigation context. And I think, for nuclear, it's a public rather than private law that you're relying on. But the comments we heard earlier this afternoon about the need to incorporate legal analysis into this, I think, are very true here as well.
Yeah, agreed. If I can just say one thing, we have 2 courses that are legal courses. They deal with the law, with information law, and with privacy law. That I would say most of the TPP students who come our direction pass through. And I attended one in Georgetown a couple weeks back where the students actually write up privacy legislation. So it's joint between MIT and Georgetown Law. So it's a joint MIT cross-listed course. And they come in teams of 2 MIT students plus 2 law students. They write up this legislation on drones, on autonomous vehicles, on employer contracts about what personal data they can see about you. And some of these have been picked up by policymakers because you get the law student and the tech students together. It's fantastic. So I think, yeah, and that's one of the great reasons that TPP has this legal requirement that you take one of these courses. So.
Just a quick build on the earlier question. I guess I was surprised to hear the question of why has there not been more conversation around corporate incentives or corporate strategy. Coming from a Carnegie Mellon EPP background, now from originally an MIT background, there's such extraordinary funding by corporations of research here that it's almost as if I would think you have that in your, front and center on a daily basis. And even if I think about the privacy group at Carnegie Mellon, they're funded by Google and Facebook. So I would almost worry more about the balance of are we thinking about social welfare at the same time? But I may have misunderstood your question, but I thought, oh wow, you can just reap hand over foot money in from companies because they recognize the challenge of these questions.
But in the dialogue that we were having today, I wasn't hearing much about how you hook into the business perspective and just the semantics of always calling it policy as opposed to policy and strategy.
Well, in the nuclear security world, for example, the reality is most companies want to have fewer requirements rather than more, right? Because it costs money. Every dollar you spend on security is a dollar you didn't spend on something that's going to bring in profit. Bottom line. So then the question is, are there ways you can structure incentives that motivate companies to do more than the minimum? So in the world of safety, for example, after 3 Mile Island, the industry really sort of got it in its gut in the United States, excuse me, bonking my microphone, that, geez, the worst performer among us can screw us all up. And so we need an industry approach to bringing everybody up to the level of the top performers. And so they created the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, which is now considered, in a way, a tougher regulator than the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And every nuclear power plant gets a rating from the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations every year, and how much insurance you pay is based on your INPO rating. Oh, wow. For one thing. Then there's also a social shaming aspect. So they have a meeting every year where every CEO of a company that owns a nuclear power plant comes to the meeting, and the couple of CEOs that had the best rating get prizes, and the CEO that had the worst rating for that year has to get up on the stage and answer questions from all the other CEOs about why are you putting my investment at risk with the way you're running your nuclear power plant. And there's a huge amount of investment that happens in the 3 months before the INPO meeting to try to avoid being the guy up on the stage answering those questions.
Just maybe it's a silly question, but the right to be forgotten and having everything on your own server, isn't that something criminals could take advantage of? Yeah. I mean, like, I want to be forgotten. I've done all these wrong things in my life, so all of a sudden I start fresh, and there's no way to trace different identities, for instance, or something like that.
Yeah, I think there's a general agreement that this law in Europe is fairly unworkable. There's no easy way to do this. I mean, the way I think a lot of these issues are being addressed now is that they will be taken out. Like, if someone approaches Google and says, "Get rid of me on the internet," what they'll do is they'll remove searches for your name in that country's Google web search. So in Spain, it would be google.es. But oftentimes, they'll still show up in google.com. So you haven't really disappeared. You're just not showing up in the search things here. But yeah, it could be used for all sorts of things. I think it's not very well thought out.
But I think what he's saying is Solid raises the same issue that, you know,
Oh, I'm sorry.
criminals use it and then nobody finds out about what they're doing.
Yeah, you have everything on your own server, so you can turn it off.
Yeah.
Police records.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is one of the things that would have to be worked out, is that you could communicate and keep your things private. I tend to err on the side that it's, for most of us, we want to keep everything. You know, we want to keep things private, and yeah, that means there's going to be some trade-offs. There will be some criminality, but this ability to keep private things private, I think, is very important.
Over here.
Matthew, you said all your information was stolen many times. How did that affect your life?
I wish I knew. As far as I have not observed obvious effects, but I mean, so I've been working in the classified world for a long time. So for me, it's just routine. There are certain things you don't have on your computer. You know, there's certain things you don't say over the phone, you know, et cetera. And so I actually think that spies are wasting their time with me, because almost everything that is on my computer ultimately gets published anyway. So, you know, at best, they're getting a 6-month head start. So I think they're paying more attention to me than I deserve.
I have had an issue with this when interviewing terrorists, which is I kind of moved into.
She used to like wander around in the Hindu Kush and so on, interviewing terrorists in their home bases.
And there was an issue, a question, how much my computer should be encrypted, and my feeling was that if Harvard, where I was at the time, took special care of me, that I would look like a spy, and that it would actually put me at risk, that it would not be good for me. I'm also on this OPM,
Right.
We get free protection. That's it, as far as I can tell.
Well, we get free access to our credit records. Woohoo!
That's true. That's true.
It sounded more, like more than that.
So if I can jump in, I used to live in Switzerland, and Switzerland was one of the last countries in Europe where you could actually pick up a SIM card for a cell phone at a store without providing your name and personal information. It's some sort of identity. You could just go in and buy a SIM card and use it. And so for years, I had this SIM card, and I would use it, and I think the Swiss would contact me periodically saying, would you please now register your name? I'd get a text, can you register this? But they didn't know who I was. And I thought, this is fantastic, because I can use this SIM card and no one's going to know I'm making calls to my mother-in-law. Very interesting. So I remember reading something on the web that they'd infiltrated a terrorist web of a terrorist cell, but who were using these Swiss these Swiss SIM cards that weren't registered to an individual, because they could just buy them off the street. So when they looked at how what happened here is they saw there were communications in the metadata saying that people in Yemen were using Swiss SIM cards that weren't registered to a person, that were making calls back to places in Europe. All of a sudden, that raised the red flags. So the Swiss were able to jump right in and start listening in on the conversations, because the fact that they were using these unregistered cards from Yemen, calling Germany, raised the red flags. So I think one of the things that we talk about, and I think Robert Hannigan from GCHQ, who came here, was this metadata is actually very valuable. Of who's talking to whom, where the calls are taking place, when they're taking place, and oftentimes it's actually more important than the content itself. So there is information there.
Except you have to pay attention and actually follow up. So Jessica and a colleague wrote a terrific chapter for a book that I've just edited with my colleague Scott Sagan about the case of Bruce Ivins, who almost certainly committed the anthrax attacks in 2001. And the number of really obvious red flags. Yeah. I mean, not just red flags, like red signal flares going off in every direction. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I mean, he sent an email to his staff complaining about his own dangerous paranoia and speculating about ending up in the newspaper as mad scientist in charge of deadly germs, and nobody reported that. Unbelievable.
And you know, it really is a good example of why organizational behavior is something worth thinking about.
And studying, yes.
Yeah. I'll take one more question. Is there one more question? Is there any student who wants to ask a question? We'd love to hear from students. If there are students who want to ask questions, we'll take more than one. No students. Okay, I think you had a question?
Thanks. I would have been happy to defer if anyone else had a question. I wanted to throw out a topic that hasn't come up yet today, but is sort of this emerging area, and that is the Internet of Things. And when I try to explain to people in very simple terms what that is, I say it answers 3 questions. What is this object? What's happening in the world? And what can I do? Because when you put sensors on an object, you can learn more about what's going on in the physical world and put it in software. And then from the software space, you can actually send impact back to the physical world. And when that's, you know, not just a person, but say automated action, and when it's around dangerous equipment, or a lot of things can happen. And to me, it's ripe for a conversation, you know, in this technology and policy space. And I'm just curious if you all have heard much in this space, or if anyone else has anything to contribute, because that's something I'm thinking a lot about for our clients.
So if I can just say one thing, we have 2 current TPP students who are working with Dave Clark right over here, who are doing their master's theses on Internet of Things. And they're looking at the security aspects of Internet of Things. And it's fascinating. I mean, this is a huge area. We're going to see billions of new sensors come online. There are lots of policy issues associated with that. Solid, one of the things that Solid's trying to do is become a platform for Internet of Things where you can control these different devices. So yeah, so I think this is a very important area. One other thing I'll say is, as part of our group, we have a team called App Inventor. And what they are is it's a platform for building Android apps that was developed by Hal Abelson in partnership with Google. So you can go on and it's this blocks, kind of like Scratch, if you're familiar with that. You can actually do these building blocks and create your own Android apps. They've got about 5 million users right now on the platform, like huge number of people running this App Inventor. And the functionality that they're bringing in now is IoT. So they're focusing on, right now, modules that will let you do Bluetooth Low Energy and communicate with different devices. And so we've got lots of UROPs, you know, these undergraduate students. We've got UROPs and MEng's master's engineering students who are working on developing connectivity between devices. And what this will really do is open up communication possibilities between your Android phone and apps and the objects around you. But yeah, this is an area for students who want an exciting area where you can kind of combine working with electronics, with software, and with policy. This is a beautiful spot.
Policy and society and business. Absolutely. I will report a few months ago, we had a talk at the Kennedy School by a former deputy director of the CIA, and one of the things he said was, if you knew what I know, you would never plug in your toaster.
That's good, that's good.
We will stop. Is there a panel or coming? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.